trashing trade deals and confronting North Korea, Donald Trump brings his unique brand of diplomacy to Asia. In the years since his election win, old alliances have been revived with dramatic effect. Key decisions have caused international outcry.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
So has Trump's America First policy helped or harmed the country's interest and its global standing?
Just continuing to sell more arms to the Middle East is like pouring gasoline on a fire. We don't need more arms in the Middle East. We need more talks.
I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to this special program as we take a look at the Trump effect on U.S. relations with the rest of the world. Hello from Washington, D.C., the setting for a year of drama here at the White House since Donald Trump's extraordinary election win last November. In the U.S. Capitol, it has been anything but business as usual as President Trump took on the role of disruptor-in-chief. And he's taken America in a new direction on the global stage, undoing agreements from the Obama era and reshaping old alliances. This week, he's in South Asia, talking tough about existing trade deals and trying to win support for the aggressive stance against North Korea. But despite the fiery statements from the president, many are asking if Trump's tactics amount to a global retreat for the United States. A year after President Trump's stunning election victory, a foreign trip to provide distance from the problems at home. Meeting China's President Xi Jinping, the contrast between the two leaders' political fortunes could not be clearer. While President Xi has been busy consolidating his grip on power at the Communist Party's 19th National Congress, President Trump is dogged by an investigation into alleged collusion with the Russian government in the election and the worst approval ratings of any first-year president. His approach to foreign policy has not often been subtle. Under his America First doctrine, friends and rivals alike have been told that diplomacy and engagement are not his priorities.
We've made other countries rich, while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon.
In January, one poll suggested that almost two-thirds of Americans supported Trump's position. It prompted one of his biggest decisions so far to pull the U.S. out of the global agreement on climate change. And he took a tough new line on Iran, effectively withdrawing the U.S.'s backing for the international deal to curb its nuclear activities. To some, the result has been the U.S. looking isolated, a cause for alarm for many in his own party and beyond.
The America First transactional approach is, I'm going to give you something, you give me something, and then we walk away. It's not a long-term sustainable policy, it's very short-term fixes, and it puts the United States in a very dangerous negotiating position because other countries around the world realize that they can lever and gain advantage against the United States by offering small benefits.
So while President Trump looks for support in his tough new approach to North Korea, there is now an increasing sense that the balance of power is shifting. So the decisions being made by Trump and his advisors at the White House are redefining the U.S.'s relations with other countries and changing the dynamics in strategically important regions. In a moment, we'll hear from Sarah Firth on Turkey's border with Syria about the U.S. involvement in the war. Nicole Johnston is in Kenya with a view on America's actions and challenges in Africa. But first, Chamim Chaudhry is in South Korea with a look at how Trump's approach to North Korea is being received.
Donald Trump's threats and strong rhetoric against North Korea have been met with mixed response in this region. Japan is firmly behind Washington, and the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has taken an equally hardline approach. In South Korea, however, there is some concern. There's a general feeling that Trump's words have been unhelpful and may further fuel an already tense situation. But when he spoke at the National Assembly here, Donald Trump made it clear that the US will always remain an ally and will come to the support of Seoul in the event of an attack. Now, his relations with China are even more complicated. China is a very strong ally of Pyongyang. At the same time, it is the US's strongest trading partner. So Donald Trump has to tread a very fine line. It doesn't want to jeopardize any kind of trade deals that it has with Beijing, but at the same time, he has said he will continue to exert pressure on Beijing to make sure that they, in turn, exert pressure in Pyongyang. Now, Donald Trump is aware that there is a perception that the US's power in the region is ebbing. And he's also afraid that he may be perceived as a weak leader. And these are just some of the things that he is keen to counter.
Well, Daesh has all but been wiped out from its territory it was holding in Syria, losing its last stronghold, the city of Deir ez-Zor, to the Syrian regime. Now, that comes after the terror group lost its so-called caliphate in Syria, the city of Raqqa, to the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. So with the fight against Daesh seemingly wrapping up on the ground, what next for the conflict in Syria? Well, the underlying issues still remain. President Assad is still in power and the fighting on the ground continues. You now have many different factions and groups holding different territories in Syria. In terms of the political and diplomatic process, what we've seen recently is the Astana peace talks held in Kazakhstan, moving the situation forward. A deal reached there between Iran, Turkey and Russia managed to establish a so-called de-escalation zone not far from here in the province of Idlib, trying to build on where the Geneva talks has stalled in the past. Now, there will be another round of Geneva talks at the end of November, but arguably US policy when it comes to Syria has never been less clear. And with more than 400,000 Syrians dead in this conflict already and the fighting still continuing, the war against Daesh in Syria might be over, but the fighting continues.
It may not be obvious, but the United States has a significant role here in Africa, and most of that is focused on counter-terrorism. Last year, US military special operations were in Libya, in the coastal city of Sirte, and they backed local militias as they fought against Daesh, eventually winning. But many of those Daesh fighters then moved to West Africa, to countries like Nigeria and Mali. And that's where America's role in the Sahel region comes in. The US has opened a military drone base in northern Niger in the town of Agadez. And recently, 4 US soldiers were killed by militants in Niger. All of this has shed light on the US military footprint here. There are 6,000 American soldiers in Africa. Most of them are based in Djibouti. When it comes to aid, though, it's a different picture. The United States is reducing its aid budget for Africa, especially in the area of development. It's also attaching conditions. For example, if you're an organisation that provides abortions, you can no longer receive funding. Diplomatically as well, there are many posts here in Africa that haven't been filled. And the US President Donald Trump's travel ban now includes the Central African country of Chad. Many people here are surprised because Chad is a US ally. So in brief, in terms of the military, the US has a big role here. But for aid, development and investment in Africa, the real player is China.
Well, with this growing list of challenges for the United States, and as China continues to spend heavily overseas, the US is now looking at dramatic cutbacks. Donald Trump wants to slash spending on foreign aid and diplomacy and has left top jobs at the State Department unfilled. James Champion has our 5 facts.
Hundreds of key positions in the Trump administration remain unfilled. Out of 608 jobs that need Senate approval, only 147 were confirmed by November. But out of 528 positions, Obama managed to get 365 confirmed by this time in 2013. At the State Department, America's foreign ministry, top jobs are vacant. In fact, 78% of top State Department jobs remain vacant a year after the election, versus 26% during the same period under Obama in 2013. American diplomacy is facing massive cuts. The State Department is due for a 33% cut in spending next year, while the defense budget is set for a rise of 9%. US budget cutting has also hit the UN. The US helped to push through a cut of $570 million from the UN's peacekeeping missions this year, and it wants more UN spending slashed. And Trump's top diplomat doesn't travel as much as his predecessors. In fact, Trump's Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has done roughly half the miles and visited half the countries that his predecessor John Kerry had 1 year after the election.
So there is growing evidence that the Trump administration is rolling back diplomacy in a significant way. Is it cause for alarm for some here in Washington? I spoke to Zalmay Khalilzad, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Iraq and Afghanistan under George W. Bush. He was considered for the post of Secretary of State by President Trump. I asked him how effective the White House's approach to global challenges can be with a weakened State Department.
Big concern about the vacancies. We need top-notch people in charge of diplomacy in terms of various regions and functions. And I don't see why that is taking so long. I know that there are some of the vetting processes are draconian, but I believe that alone cannot explain the amount of time that's taken.
But are you concerned at all that the Trump administration is abandoning the U.S.'s traditional principles of diplomacy and favoring a more hawkish, militaristic approach, despite what we heard from candidate Trump, that he was very much against so-called U.S. military adventures and what he himself called America's stupid wars?
Well, we need a strong military, given where the world is, the challenges that the world faces. But we also need strong diplomacy. There is no question about that. Sometimes effective diplomacy can reduce the need to use military force. And the best approach is an integration of diplomacy and military and development and humanitarian assistance program, among other things. So I would be concerned if the president wanted to downplay diplomacy. But like the military, I believe that our State Department also needs to be reformed. The Secretary of State needs to move energetically to nominate people to senior positions. This has been more than almost a year.
But are you concerned about the tone?
Well, sometimes the tone leaves something to be desired, but I think the president has his own style of getting attention, because sometimes he says that when I speak in the language of diplomacy, that people don't pay attention to it, it's dismissed. For example, he had mentioned in my own discussion with him at times that, look, NATO, we have been trying for 15, 20 years to improve burden sharing. And we have spoken diplomatically. It hasn't produced results. Sometimes in order to get something done, you need to say something that people will pay attention to.
Well, improvement in burden sharing potentially, but when you look at the situation in your native Afghanistan,
right,
and you did serve there under the Bush
right,
administration, the conflict is in its 16th year.
Right.
It has cost the United States $1 trillion,
right,
almost 3,000 lives, not to mention the tens of thousands of Afghan casualties. Absolutely. And now, in the last couple of weeks, the Taliban is resurgent, gaining more and more territory. The
right,
security situation is deteriorating.
Yeah.
You're fighting ISIS and ISIS-linked groups there
right,
as well. Are
right,
we back to square one?
I don't think we are back to square one. Afghanistan today is fundamentally different than it was 16 years ago. Look at all kinds of indicators, schools, hospitals, roads, telephones, you name it, life expectancy. And most importantly, Afghanistan has its own security forces that is doing the fighting. We used to have 140.
But it isn't doing very well.
Because the previous administration, unfortunately, withdrew too much too soon, didn't listen to the military. From 140, we went to less than 10,000. And the president actually had indicated that he wanted to bring them all home, thus encouraging the persistence of the insurgency. I think this administration has got a better strategy, in my view, which is to focus on the sanctuaries, the Pakistani double game, where they are both our allies and also support the insurgents who are fighting us. If we can turn Pakistan which the previous administrations were not able to and didn't focus sharply on, it will be a big change.
But before we get to Pakistan, you mentioned the numbers. The United States had more than 100,000 troops.
Right.
Yet it wasn't able to defeat the Taliban.
Right.
Will the 4,000 additional troops that President Trump has authorized make any difference in changing the dynamics?
Sure. I think it changes the expectations game. The Taliban were thinking that time is on their side, the U.S. is going to leave. The purpose is not to defeat as such the Taliban. The purpose is to change their calculus, that the U.S. isn't going to abandon Afghanistan again. They're not going to win, and that therefore the only way out for them and for Afghanistan is a negotiated settlement.
You mentioned Pakistan moments ago. Trump's Afghan strategy has been to throw India into the mix,
right,
giving it a megaphone,
right,
in fact, inviting it to the table,
right,
regardless of the tensions we all know about between Pakistan and India in the region. Sure. Is that a wise decision? I mean, can you afford to alienate Pakistan?
I think it's a smart decision, in my view. The reason is Pakistan fears that the most. India on both east and west. So if it doesn't want that, because if this war goes on, that's what we're saying we're going to do. We're going to do burden sharing with India to stabilize Afghanistan. And if I was a Pakistani strategist, this is not what I want. So this is a huge leverage that the previous administrations did not use, thinking that will upset Pakistan. But in fact, we didn't use it, and Pakistan did not change strategy. Charm, engagement, financial support, military support didn't produce it. So therefore, I think it's quite clever in some way. But we have to be careful not to go too far with that. But we need to put our own pressure on Pakistan. We have given them a list of demands. They have some time to respond to it, and if not, we would have to have a game plan for what to do.
Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad speaking to me a little earlier. Now, Donald Trump has shown time and again that he is a U.S. president like no other. And it's not just his actions, but his words that have raised eyebrows. Well, here's some of the Trump talk we've heard on the international stage.
Totally. It's not a Muslim ban, but we were totally prepared. It's working out very nicely. The nation of Qatar, unfortunately, has historically been a funder of terrorism. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself. The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible misery and suffering on the good people of that country. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you. America will continue its support for the Afghan government and the Afghan military as they confront the Taliban in the field. Nambia's health system is increasingly self-sufficient. I have so many friends going to your countries trying to get rich.
Well, Donald Trump's style is certainly different, but his decisions have prompted questions about America's position in the world and whether it is leaving behind its role as global leader. So plenty to talk about with our guests who are joining me here. Colonel Lawrence Wilkinson is former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and J.D. Gordon is the Trump campaign's former national security advisor. Welcome to you both. A lot of conflicting signals in the last 9 or 10 months since President Trump has been in office. As candidate, he promised, Colonel Wilkinson, to be unpredictable. And I suppose on this front, at least, he hasn't disappointed.
No, I would say, though, that as a scholar of U.S. foreign and security policy, that unpredictability in a status quo power, let alone a great power, is not necessarily a positive. And I would add that though I've seen stirrings of this kind of presidency before, I think this is the most bizarre one I've ever seen. And when I say I've seen stirrings, there were groups of people in both political parties in 1947-48 who essentially wanted America to be insular, to build fences, if you will, to be isolationist in the scholarly term, and to not be a part of the international community. And they fought vigorously against people like Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, James Forrestal, Stuart Obenstadt, and others who wanted America to stay in the world.
Is the president being isolationist, though? Because some would argue
there's
that.
Reason to believe that his rhetoric, at least, leads one to believe that we are entering a period where America first is not just a mantra to please a political audience. It's rhetoric to also describe what might be forming as its foreign policy.
So beyond the mantra of America First, J.D. Gordon, which sounds appealing to a large segment of the American public, obviously, who voted him in, is there much about Donald Trump's foreign policy that seems predictable to you, beyond the tweeting habit, of course?
I think so. I think that if you look at the statements he made on the campaign, that he wants our allies to pay their fair share for our own collective self-defense, that makes a lot of sense. You know, the United States is in about $20 trillion in debt. NATO, as we know, has 28 countries. Of those 28 countries, only 5 pay that 2% of their GDP that they're supposed to pay, that they've agreed to pay. So I think that President Trump is making a point to the American people, and they respect to that. They elected him because they don't want America to be the power that pays for everybody else's security so they could have better healthcare, for instance, better education.
Sure, but I mean, doesn't the president's rhetoric, though, its threats against North Korea, its bellicose statements again on Iran, on Syria, other countries, doesn't it open the United States to the possibility of going into wars, not retracting itself, as he had said during the campaign? There's a report that's just out today that suggests that the U.S. has already spent $5.6 trillion on its wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan.
Well, clearly those wars have scaled back dramatically since the past decade. However, what I would say is that the American people want to change. We clearly have seen past presidents not be able to get the job done to dissuade North Korea from its nuclear program, its missile program. They've all failed. President Clinton, President Obama, President Bush, all of them failed. So President Trump is trying a different approach to be tough with North Korea. He just needs to back up his tough rhetoric with tough action.
As a previous military man, do you think the tough rhetoric is one that will pay off, taunting the leader of North Korea, Rocket Man?
I don't disagree with the idea that our allies need to burden share better, and I don't disagree with some of the other comments he made, mostly during his campaign, that he's more or less sort of backed away from as president. What I object to...
On North Korea, are you concerned at all?
What I object to is the incoherence of the foreign policy with respect to people like the South Koreans, like the Germans, the French, the British, and other allies. There's an old theory of international relations that we forget at our peril. It's called conservation of enemies. And it means simply that you don't want any more at any given time than you need. Well, this president has produced a whole host of enemies out there for us. One of them, remarkably, probably one of the worst right now, having adopted as its doctrine the use of nuclear weapons against our supposed superiority in conventional missions, Russia, he seems to be reluctant to criticize, though. So I'm really concerned, as a student of, as a teacher of U.S. foreign and security policy, what I'm seeing coming from this White House, which seems to be more incoherent than anything else.
So the incoherence about Russia, J.D. Gordon, and you were intimately involved with the Trump campaign. In fact, this whole host of investigations going on right now, the special counsel, the FBI, and others investigating the potential collusion that has gone on between the Trump campaign and Russia in the election, and Russian meddling as well. Where do you see all that? And how much does it turn President Trump into a bit of a lame duck, someone who is not able to perform efficiently on the international stage?
Well, what I'd say about Russia is that every president since the Cold War has tried for better relations with Russia. President Obama did, President Bush did, President Clinton did, Hillary Clinton even had the famous reset button. So they all wanted better relations with Russia. And one of the reasons is because we're so high in debt. So why should we be at loggerheads with Russia to the extent that we're not combating the threats that we both face, such as radical Islamic terror groups?
But what do you make about the indictments that have already reached deep into his inner circle? If there is a couple more of these, even if the president isn't ultimately impeached, how much does it harm his international stature?
Well, it's certainly damaging. But if you look at what's happened with the whole Trump-Russia saga, I would describe it as the hoax of the century. Now, that doesn't mean people aren't going to go to prison either. I think the indictments we saw against our campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, his assistant, Rick Gates, reflected things that happened way before the campaign regarding allegations of money laundering and tax evasion, and nothing to do with collusion with Russia whatsoever.
What do you make of this idea that the United States, well, certainly seen from the outside, has raised quite a bit of alarm among people looking on, traditional allies who've seen the U.S. under President Trump undoing a lot of the previous administration's international agreements? Does it devalue in any way the voice of the United States?
Well, continuity in governance, especially in terms of foreign and security policy, is an important ingredient of international relations. I think probably the most egregious act in that regard is a multilateral agreement that was negotiated with the P5 plus Germany and the European Union and Iran on its nuclear weapons program, if indeed it had a nuclear weapons program, is the most egregious case in point. Here we have an administration that ostensibly wants to work out some sort of agreement with the DPRK, North Korea, but if I were Kim Jong-un, I wouldn't trust us any further than I could spit. In fact, as Angela Merkel, leader of probably the new leader of the free world, Germany, suggested, we have become, even to our allies, apparently a very untrustworthy ally. That's really hard for me to take. I admit I've been an exponent of this global role for the United States over the last 50 years. It's really hard for me to take that the leader of Germany would be vouchsafing that we're no longer trustworthy.
Well, what do you think of those statements?
Well, I think that Europe has really benefited from the U.S. helping to carry the load significantly for them. If you look at the standard of living in Germany, I've been to Germany many times. I lived in Italy for 2 years. I just returned to speak at the European Parliament's EPP Party end of summer conference, interacted with a lot of members of parliament from throughout Europe. And what I'd say is their security has been underwritten by us. The standard of living is better. If you talk about healthcare, infrastructure, education for the people in Germany. And why is that? Because the U.S. has spent so much of our money on their security. Meanwhile, our cities are crumbling in places like Detroit. We need to fix America. So that's what I would say to that.
But is Trump able to fix America while making the place of America in the world far smaller, and some would argue being a godsend to countries like China and Russia who are on the rise?
This is something that troubles me too, is he doesn't seem to be able to accomplish anything domestically. And that's my political party's fault, the Republicans to a certain extent, some Democrats. But it's also the fact that
not a single major legislation passed.
Yeah, he set up this adversarial relationship. And I'll tell you from my study of 1945 on, every president, the most successful time for all of them is that first 18 months in terms of the Congress and legislature. Look at Ronald Reagan. He got half of his agenda passed in that time. So it's really daunting that he has accomplished nothing.
He's accomplished nothing, many would say, and he's taken on issues like the travel ban. Was that a mistake in hindsight?
Well, what I would say is that we've never had a presidency quite like President Trump. He was a reality TV star, and I think that he had a lot of views that resonated with the American people. They elected him to see if he can get the job done. However, he ran into the buzzsaw of the establishment, both Democrats, both Republicans, that have tried to block him at every single turn. So that's why he hasn't been able to achieve much, because they want to fight with him.
Well, we'll see what the voters say in the midterm elections, which are fast approaching. But for now, thanks very much, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson and J.D. Gordon. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, among the promises that propelled Donald Trump to the White House was a tough new approach to the U.S.'s southern border. His pledges to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it have faltered, but relations between the two neighbors have not improved. Trump is threatening to tear up a key trade deal crucial to Mexico's economy. And to Mexicans, Trump has become more than just a noisy neighbor, as Alistair Bavistock reports.
A year on from his election victory, Donald Trump is a regular presence at Mexican birthday parties. For Mexicans, piñata effigies of the US president are now top sellers.
Trump was a great candidate to become a piñata for national unity. Trump is a very difficult character to deal with, and this has had a tremendous cost on the Mexico-US relationship. A lot of people thought that eventually Trump will pivot and move more towards the center. He hasn't pivoted, and he probably won't. But it took a while for the Mexican government to realize that and then to adjust its strategy to deal with him.
Trump's first 9 months in office have not been easy on Mexican-US relations. The peso plunged by 15% last November as it became clear that the country's greatest antagonist would occupy the White House, and his pledges to withdraw from the NAFTA trade pact may put Mexico in further economic difficulty. The Mexican president was scheduled to be his first official visitor after taking office, but after a breakdown of communication, the state visit was cancelled. But Trump's presence in the White House will have its own political implications in Mexico. The 1st of July will see the country's own presidential elections, and how to handle Trump will be a key question.
Because Trump is going to become an issue. How to deal with Trump? What's your policy? What's your proposal? Everybody is going to ask the candidates that. But there's a larger question that sooner or later Mexico is going to have to deal with, which is not Trump, but Trumpism.
As America marks a year since Trump's election victory, Mexico's government has adopted a policy of patient diplomacy. But with elections due in 8 months, many people here are wondering if that is the most effective way for Mexico to deal with President Trump. Alistair Baverstock, TRT World, Mexico City.
Still ahead on this special program, sword dances and weapons of a different sort. How Donald Trump's arms deals and alliance with Saudi Arabia have created a dramatic new dynamic in the Middle East. Welcome back to the program. Donald Trump's first overseas trip caused shockwaves that are still being felt today. Visiting Saudi Arabia, he signed a massive arms deal and has given his backing to the blockade of Qatar and recently the crackdown on senior royals in the Saudi kingdom. Hassan Ali has our 2-minute memo.
I am Ghida.
Glowing orbs and sword dances were just two of the highlights of President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, his first foreign visit since taking office. But swords were not the only weapons changing hands. The US and Saudi Arabia also concluded an arms deal worth over $350 billion, the largest in US history. And the timing appeared to be crucial. The visit and the deal coincided with the rise of this man, Mohammed bin Salman, who became Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia soon after Trump's visit. Bin Salman has decided to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy and was a prime mover in the decision to go to war in Yemen in 2015. So what about the reaction? Human rights groups led the criticism of the deal, and Republican Senator Rand Paul tabled a resolution that almost succeeded in blocking the agreement.
This barbaric nation should not be getting our weapons.
But the aftermath of the visit was even more dramatic. Soon after Trump returned, Saudi Arabia persuaded a coalition of Arab countries to cut off diplomatic ties with Qatar, a decision strongly backed by Trump. Among the reasons given, Qatar's relationship with Iran and its alleged support for terrorists, something it flatly denies. So what next? Well, the Saudi-US relationship continues to strengthen. The two administrations are united in their hostility towards Iran and are likely to cooperate further to try to isolate it.
Well, Donald Trump continues to give his backing to Saudi Arabia. It's recently stepped up its rhetoric against Iran. It has been accused of ousting Lebanon's prime minister, and the Crown Prince has detained senior royals and top officials. Trump has tweeted about that crackdown, saying, "I have great confidence in King Salman and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. They know exactly what they are doing. Some of those they are harshly treating have been milking their country for years. Well, let's talk more about this with Adam Morelli, a former U.S. ambassador to Bahrain and a former State Department official. Some quite extraordinary developments over the last few days in Riyadh, yet President Trump throwing his weight quite squarely behind the Crown Prince. Why?
In the Middle East, it's important to know who your friends are and who your enemies are, and to stand by your friends in order to confront your enemies. Saudi Arabia has been in front of the United States since its earliest days. I think we all know the picture of King Abdulaziz and Franklin Roosevelt on the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake in 1944. And since then, the Saudi-U.S. relationship has been a pillar of regional security.
But you could argue so has Qatar. It's been a strong ally of the U.S. You've got the U.S.'s biggest military base in Qatar, yet Trump actually relished the role of helping the Saudis create that rift.
Let's get back to that point. Let's get back to that point. I have a different interpretation of those events, but we can talk about that later.
But why Saudi Arabia?
When I talk about who the friends are and who the enemies are, Saudi Arabia is a friend, Iran is an enemy.
Okay, but we're leaving Iran aside for the moment.
We need Saudi Arabia to confront Iran. If the United States is going to contain a malign Iranian influence in the region, which I think we can all agree is there and is a danger, then we need Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia needs us.
But so many would argue, though, this is major escalation. I mean, this isn't just...
Well, yes and no. It's major escalation on our side, but it's in response to steadying escalation from Iran's side over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, look what Iran has done in the last 4 or 5 years. They have escalated their involvement and their control and their influence in the region, and we've done nothing. We've either stood by and let them do it, or we've actually helped them to do it by getting them off of sanctions.
But let's get back to Saudi Arabia, though. To what extent is there a very close coordination, not just a green light that's been given by the Trump administration, but in fact more than that, because we know that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, his trusted advisor, just returned from Saudi Arabia a few days ago.
Yes. Well, I think the coordination between Saudi Arabia and the United States is no secret. I think, and you mentioned it in your report, I mean, Trump's first visit overseas as president, was to Saudi Arabia. I can't think of any other American president whose first visit overseas was to Saudi Arabia.
And was this just about the money, the $110 billion in arms deals, the fact that the United States would like the Saudis to list Aramco, the giant oil company, on the
obviously that was an element in things, but I think that the bigger consideration, as I said before, is Saudi Arabia had been neglected by the Obama administration. The relationship was in the toilet, frankly. And Trump wanted to do two things by that visit. Number one, to reassure and remind the leaders of the region that the United States was not going to walk away from them. The United States knew that they were our friends and was going to stand on their side. And number two, to coordinate with the countries of the region a strategy for confronting our twin shared enemies, Iran and radical violent extremism.
But of course, you keep mentioning Iran and radical violent extremism, but the administration seems to forget what is going on in Yemen. This U.S. Saudi-led military campaign that has gone on for a while, that has failed by every account, and that has at least cost 10,000 civilian deaths, if not more. What message is the U.S. sending, giving the Saudis more and more arms while this type of war continues to rage?
Well, I would say two things to that. One is, obviously there is considerable concern by many in the United States about the war in Yemen, from both a humanitarian angle as well as a strategic angle. And I think you'll note that Senator Corker and others have said we're not going to approve lethal arms sales to any country in the Gulf as long as this thing is continuing. So there's obviously concern. But I would take another look at it. What's the situation between Lebanon and Israel? I know it's not a direct answer to the question, but I'm going to get to it. What's the situation between Iran and Israel? Hezbollah, Lebanon and Israel. Hezbollah has a military capability that includes hundreds of missiles capable of reaching any city in Israel.
So beyond the money,
that is a level of strategic threat that has paralyzed that part of the region.
But are you suggesting then that
is
it wise then for the United States and Israel to be fueling these types of tensions between the Saudis and Iran, potentially moving them into an open conflict?
Well, I think the Saudis looked at what happened in Lebanon and Israel and said, we're not going to let that happen to us. We are not going to let Iran establish a bridgehead on our southern border, arm it the way they've armed Hezbollah in Lebanon, and threaten the security of the kingdom. That's why they acted in Yemen. Has it cost lives? Yes. Is it bad? I mean, is it bad for the people of Yemen? Yes. But I would also argue...
Is it bad for the United States in the long term?
But I would also argue that when you look at the damage caused in Yemen, there's plenty of blame to go around. It's not just Saudi Arabia, it's also the Houthis and it's also Iran.
Ambassador Adam Mouradi, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Trump says his policies towards Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others are about putting America first. But many people here in Washington disagree. We can now hear from one of them, Paul Kawika-Martin from Peace Action. He is the man behind our big idea that Donald Trump is making the United States less safe.
I'm very concerned that this Trump administration has made the U.S. less safe and not more. Just continuing to sell more arms to the Middle East is like pouring gasoline on a fire. We don't need more arms in the Middle East. We need more talks. Not arms, handshakes is what we need in the Middle East. I would be very concerned about North Korea and how the Trump administration has been dealing with that. People ask, are we going to go to war with North Korea? I say we're already at war with North Korea. We're at a word war with two kind of megalomaniacs going back and forth. Words matter. Words have an effect. And certainly maybe in the business realm, being bombastic might have worked for him. But on the diplomatic stage, when every world leader and diplomat is hanging on every word, it's not making us safer. So think about what you say, because it actually makes a big difference. Pulling out of the Paris Accord sends a signal that we're not a good international actor. And on the security front, the Pentagon has said over and over again, one of the biggest security risks is climate change. All of these type of actions, I think, actually make the U.S. less safe and more probable that something is going to happen.
So is Trump really making the U.S. less safe? Well, let's talk to our guest about this. We have with us Benjamin Friedman, adjunct professor at George Washington University, and Neil McCabe, a former reporter with Breitbart News. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Neil McCabe. We've been saying over the last hour or so that Trump has been known to belittle, almost deride his Secretary of State, his own Attorney General, undermining essentially many of the United States' top institutions. By doing that, is he also undermining American democracy and making America less, not more, but less safe?
I think what we're seeing is that democracy is not being endangered by hurting the feelings of Rex Tillerson, who's a big boy and he can handle it.
But it isn't the feelings of people, but it's the institutions themselves.
Well, I think the State Department and the rest of the federal national security community, infrastructure, bureaucracy, it's getting some electric shock therapy. And Trump is delivering these shocks to a sort of a stagnant establishment status quo. And he also needs to signal to the rest of the world that there is a new administration and there's new policy. I think it's very dangerous for the world when people don't understand there's been a shift. Certainly Saddam Hussein thought that he could treat George W. Bush the same way he had treated Bill Clinton. And then what happened?
Shock therapy, but we're not talking about Saddam Hussein. We're talking today, for example, about a nuclear weaponized country.
Right.
For a fact, we know that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons. Is it wise for the US president to take on Kim Jong-un in the way he has?
Yes. Well, I mean, what's the alternative? To continue to fund them, to continue to abate them, to continue to say, fine, build these missiles that can hit Los Angeles?
Fine, so he takes them on rhetorically, Benjamin Friedman. Is he serious, though, about this threat? We know that the U.S. has positioned some of its aircraft carriers and submarines and the rest of it on the Korean Peninsula. How serious is he when he threatens the North Koreans?
Well, I think the U.S. government's very serious about it. I don't think President Trump is serious about anything particularly. I mean, he has no follow-through. You know, we talk about he's not attacking the State Department, really, by the way. He's attacking his own Secretary of State. But he doesn't follow through on that. He doesn't follow through on any policy proposals, really. He changes his mind about things. He changes his mind about people. You know, he said in February, I think it was, or shortly even before he entered office, about North Korea's ballistic missiles and their nuke program. He said it's not going to happen, right? And here we're sitting here now in November, and it's happened. They have a long-range ballistic missile that they can arm with a nuclear weapon.
And we know that the Pentagon has issued a report just last week at the behest, it would seem, of some 16 lawmakers or so who are quite concerned, alarmed that if the U.S. does launch some kind of military offensive against North Korea, it could result within a matter of days. It could result in 300,000
well, I think it's interesting.
Deaths or more. I mean,
you have to remember that the Trump that's described by the mainstream media and the Trump that in practice are two different people. So yes, he said some things in February, but in practice, what he's done is very nuanced, very measured. And as a New Yorker, and I think this is key to his personality, in New York, there's a lot of, relationships are very important. And so when he reached out to the Chinese, he's reaching out to the Japanese and our East Asian allies, he's developing personal relationships with them, which certainly Obama was virtually incapable of.
It wasn't just in February, Benjamin Friedman. It was at the United Nations in September when he talked about the total destruction of an entire country, North Korea. I mean, that shocked a lot of people. Is he displaying more of a nuance, though, in the last few days since he's been in Asia?
He's in range of North Korean missiles now, and he was meeting with the South Korean prime minister, and it's not surprising that he had a more measured tone in that circumstance. I imagine that when he gets back here to Washington, he'll be his old belligerent self. But I think it's important to focus on the policy. The United States has no good option towards North Korea. If we were to attack them, they can open up with a large amount of artillery on South Korea, on Seoul. The South Koreans will never go along with that. And so we're sort of stuck with the situation where we have to contain North Korea, which, by the way, is not very hard. So, you know, sticking with the status quo, it's terrible for people who live in North Korea, but for the United States is very safe. We're safe under Obama, and we're safe in spite of Trump still.
Are we safe under Trump? When I say we, the United States, because let me provoke you a little bit here into talking about whether or not Trump in fact knows what he is talking about when he talks about keeping Americans safe. Because, I mean, we have seen him invest quite a lot of his political capital into the travel bans, which have gone nowhere, trying to stop immigration from predominantly Muslim countries. But when you look at the recurrent, quite endemic mass shootings on U.S. territory, it has nothing to do with immigration.
Well, you're throwing a lot up on the wall just to see what sticks.
How does he keep America safe? By seemingly
by neutralizing threats. And so, yes, he spoke very tough in February, spoke very tough on the UN. But I don't think because he did not obliterate North Korea, that means he has no credibility or that he has no follow-through. I mean, your follow-through, Professor, is obliterating North Korea. And I think that we both would agree that his approach has been reasonable, it's been professional, it's been appropriate, and he's certainly recognizing that North Korea is inside the sphere of influence of China. And so by dealing with China and establishing those one-on-one relationships, he's putting us in a much better position than 8 years of Obama, where we just sort of ignore the problem.
Is he doing pretty much what every other president has done, perhaps in his own different way, you know, putting the slogan into sort of action, essentially the American exceptionalism that was conveyed in his Making America Great Again? Is he doing what everyone else has done, but in a different way?
The person who ran for president had a bunch of contradictory views about, you know, we should be a more isolationist country, we should be less involved in alliances and trade. And in practice, as president, he's sort of fallen into the consensus. We have all the same alliances we had. We have pulled out of the trade deal of the Pacific trade deal and the Paris Climate Accords, which is a big deal. But at the same time, we're doing most of the things we were doing before, only a little bit more. So I think we've had the same good old U.S. foreign policy, which to me is much too aggressive. I don't think we should bomb North Korea.
So we're doing everything.
We're doing everything else a little harder.
So no change in NATO?
When there's been no change in NATO. No. When Donald Trump took office, the United States was making war on 7 countries. He's increased the intensity of all those wars, and he's threatening to make 2 more. He hasn't given $1 more to the military because he can't get a budget passed, but he's overburdening it with all these wars and potential wars he wants to fight. So I think he's been basically utterly incompetent when it comes to running U.S. foreign policy, and we just hope that he doesn't blunder into a major war.
Isn't the U.S. being overstretched, as Benjamin points out? I mean,
we're
again,
like a big, powerful, rich country.
Again, a report coming out of the Pentagon again just a couple of days ago.
We can fight big wars.
Well, there's another front that Trump is opening, apparently, in Somalia, with a military campaign against ISIS. So on the one hand, ISIS is somewhat on the retreat in Syria and Iraq, but then you have all these new fronts opening up in Africa.
I think that what we saw in Iraq with ISIS is that the Islamic State is being obliterated in Iraq and wiped out. So Trump is fighting wars to conclusion so that they can be shut down. And so it no longer is a factor in Iraq. And so, President Trump did not invent American involvement in Somalia. That no one's suggesting that, right? We didn't open that up under Trump. That's been going on for 20 plus years.
That's a new front that the U.S. has launched, yes.
It's not new. It's old.
Under the Trump administration.
It's been going on since Black Hawk Down.
Right.
But Trump will fight a war to conclusion. And I think that's what the American people want. The American people will understand a war. What they don't understand is a war that drags on forever with no intention of winning it or concluding it.
Which might be the case in Afghanistan. But a final, very quick thought, Benjamin Friedman.
He had the good fortune of inheriting these wars at a time when ISIS was losing. And so ISIS is lost. He had the same policy Obama had. He said he was going to have a whole different plan. That wasn't true. He basically just carried through the policy he had in Syria and Iraq.
Benjamin Friedman and Neil McCabe, thank you both very much indeed. So as Donald Trump continues his Asia trip, there will probably have been little time to reflect on the bigger picture that is emerging from his first 10 months in office. He may have won support at home for his uncompromising style, but at times he's cut an isolated figure at international summits, no longer guaranteed a spot in center stage. And meeting China's powerful president may just be a reminder that America's grip on global leadership is slipping, with rival powers ready to flex their own muscles. While many of Trump's tweets and pronouncements over the past year have caused fear or derision here in the United States and in the larger world, one thing is clear: the aura of the United States is being undermined, while China is slowly emerging as a responsible and reliable new superpower. So that is all from Washington. From me, Ghida, Fakhry, and all the team here, goodbye, and thanks for watching.